is that we are actually kind of in a new phase of how the global economy works. And I think regardless of how this specific round of tariffs ultimately ends up getting implemented here, like the idea that we are in a fully globalist peak globalization movement, I think that that is past, right? So I think that the idea here is to say in a world in which like we're seeing an increasingly protectionist industrial policies, what does that mean for my business? Hi there. Hey, my name is Bret Boyd. I am the co-founder and CEO of Sustainment. I am joined by Mitch Gutkowski, who leads our supply chain business at Sustainment. And so we are in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We're actually in town for the Irving Manufacturing Conference. And we happen to be here in kind of an interesting time for the manufacturing and supply chain business. It's April 8th. The big tariff announcement was last week. And so we have the perspective of talking to dozens or hundreds of manufacturers here over the past week about kind of what they're doing, how they're thinking about it, and generally if, how, and in what degree to react to the changing global environment. And to say a kind of a quick word on this, like the goal of this conversation is actually not to talk about are tariffs good or tariffs bad or why are there tariffs and so on. I would just kind of say an underlying premise of mine is that the world has changed. Like we are past peak globalization here. I think that the idea that China has risen as a significant peer competitor to the United States is actually forcing strategic decisions around industrial policy that will endure regardless of who's in the White House. Now, tariffs and monetary policy can be implemented a ton of different ways, and I'm not actually trying to sit in a seat where I'm passing value judgments on whether these are being implemented correctly or not. I just want to say the point that like the world has changed, right? So this idea that we can be, fully globalized, fully optimized for costs, who cares where things are made, that world is gone, right? So again, in an increasingly competitive world, industrial policy is actually one of the key underpins of national strength. And I think that the Trump administration in his first presidency and the Biden administration and certainly the second Trump administration have all been hyper focused on how to essentially reindustrialize and strengthen the United States manufacturing industrial base. So anyways, I'm going to say that is an underlying premise for this conversation. But really the discussion that we want to have is actually like, what do you do about it? So like who we want to talk to in this conversation are the hundreds of thousands of American manufacturers who have global supply chains, who have onshore suppliers, nearshore suppliers, and global suppliers, and are facing a very, very difficult, dangerous, and complicated time to say, oh goodness, like what do we do about this? As these are long-term relationships, they can be hard to change. This is not a switch that you flip on and off. So we want to try to be helpful and kind of share what we see as best practices for how other organizations that are in our orbit are thinking about this and what they're doing about it.
Right. There's plenty of opinions on tariffs right now, so we're actually trying to give people some action items.
No, that's a good call out. So let's kind of talk about the state of, I don't know, the state of the union or the state of kind of what we see. Like our business is focused on, call it mid-market OEMs. So the 50 or 100 employee up to the, I don't know, call it 2 to 5,000 employee businesses. And I guess normally what we see is that these businesses will have, 50 to 250 different suppliers in their network. They'll be active with, maybe a third to a half of those at any given time. But could you talk a little bit about what you see as far as the distribution of like onshore versus nearshore versus fully globalized supply chains? I just want to frame the problem of kind of what we see as far as the breadth and global distribution of supply chains.
Yeah, I think in the mid-market, there's a lot of commodities that are pushed overseas, injection molding being a very common thing that's done overseas, plastics and, kind of those commoditized high volume manufacturing. And in the mid-market, we actually see a lot of the companies have kept, lower volume machining and things like that domestically. So they should have less risk there. And when it actually comes to those high volume parts, it's going to take a good amount of time to bring that stuff back domestically. Injection molding is a very interesting, part of that for the mid-market because, tool and dies are mostly made in China, even for domestic injection molders. So even if you want to move that domestically, there's going to be years and years of lead time in those tools as people are trying to bring them overseas. And we see, Chinese manufacturers trying to hold on to those tools and make it slow. So, there's not just the idea of how fast I can move parts, but you have to look at every commodity and every aspect of your supply chain and understand, what can actually be reshored versus nearshored, and where are you going to have to go to more allied nations.
Yeah. Look, it's a great call out. And this is one of these areas where, like, it's really easy to simplify supply chains if you're not in this industry. And in reality, though, these are like deep, year-long, in some cases, decade-long relationships where you've really worked and invested in and spent time with these businesses who deeply understand you, who are actually building very specific. You've gone through all of the engineering, revision management back and forth to make sure that that you're on the same page. And these relationships happen. Obviously they're easier to develop and manage locally, but like a lot of the companies that we work with actually view their international partners as valued teammates, part of their ultimate supply chains. And it is like, so this idea of trying to make the right decisions around where to detach from international suppliers, how to even explore developing those relationships with, either nearshore or onshore suppliers, and then actually going through the iteration and that whole process to actually get to the ultimate kind of part and form factor and quality levels and so on that you need is pretty complicated. Like, this is not like a switch that you flip on and off.
Yeah, and I think there's this misconception that, everything done overseas is simple and that you can just bring things back. But in reality, over the past 3 decades, China has built up skill sets that are pretty much lost in the United States. There's a lot of things that, are built maybe only in the defense sector. But if you were to try to reshore all of that today, it would take a decade to reshore everything. So there is these stages that companies need to look at. And as I'm having conversations with customers, the main thing I'm telling them to do is really make sure you look at your entire supply chain today and think about what are the short-term actions I can take and what is the long-term planning I need to do. So if there is stuff you can quickly move because, there's Mexican suppliers or US suppliers who make similar products, and you can change those purchase orders right away, go ahead and do it. But trying to scramble on the long-term stuff is not a good plan.
Yeah.
You're going to want to make sure you're getting quotes across not just domestic, but overseas suppliers and kind of being prepared for where these tariffs end up in the next year or two. We know that they're going to be there, but at what level? The total cost of ownership on the long term is what you need to be thinking about.
Well, so let's start at that. So I think you introduced a framework that said, hey, like, let's look at your supply chain and let's actually identify things that we need to things that we need to consider transitioning in the near term versus the long term. Like, let's actually dig into this and kind of go step by step. So how would you bucket your subcomponents or your suppliers there?
And this is where I think the conversation needs to be very cross-functional. So supply chain sometimes exists in a vacuum, but for these contract manufacturers and these OEMs, it's important to have the 3 silos of engineering, quality, and supply chain really come together and become one org. I do recommend that you have a tiger team or war room type situation at this point where you have a dedicated person from the supply chain group, engineering, and quality, who are sitting there and looking and saying what work transfers can have the, biggest mitigation on these headwinds today, where, the quality team will say, hey, we've had a lot of issue with XYZ part. So if we were to move it today, sure, we could mitigate headwinds, but we're worried about the quality we would get if we moved too fast. So those are parts that you would kick down the road. But as you talk to engineering and quality, you'd be able to understand, okay, here's a bucket of parts where, it's quite simple machining or it's a simple injection molded component. Let's, prioritize these and move them because there's less quality risk and we can mitigate headwinds fast. So you need to have that, it's not just dollars and cents. You need to make sure as you're making these moves, you're not putting the quality of your assemblies at risk.
Yeah. I mean, there's also probably the price calculus as well. Like, if I'm actually looking at the cost build of my ultimate end item that I'm selling to my customers here, like, figuring out kind of where a 20-30% tariff or whatever is going to destroy my overall cost to my customer matters as well. So, okay, so we've got a framework to think about, what do we attack first and then what do we look at later? But so let's get into that. Like, so how do you go about the process or where do you start? And do you suggest, let's talk about the nearshore versus onshore, and then let's actually talk a little bit about this idea of identifying and developing relationships specifically onshore.
Yeah, so what I'm doing with my clients is I'm actually working with them to ensure that they are going through quoting in North America and in the United States on every product. We're going nearshoring and domestic because we do believe that long term there will be tariffs, but the USMCA and our neighboring partners will always be strong trading partners, even if there is a bit of strife between there. So I'm going through full quoting with suppliers across North America on all the different product lines. And then we're trying to make that analysis of, okay, do we move something fully domestic if it has, say, 10% higher price than Mexico, knowing that, we might be at risk if the tariffs go away and we move stuff domestically, versus, are we going to keep XYZ in Southeast Asia? There's a lot that goes into making those decisions, but for now, yeah, customers need to not just be thinking about reshoring because it is nice to look at domestic, but we know these suppliers are going to be inundated with people reaching out and they're going to get a large backlog. So preparing to go to lower tariff areas is also important.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. So if you play this out, right? So you've got, so we've got a very complicated environment right now. Like everybody's on blast, tariffs are everywhere. They're significantly higher than anybody expected. Stock markets are freaking out and so on. And this will settle into some sort of a normal, right? And again, I strongly believe that we are not going back. Like there will be a new normal that this settles into. But it's not actually clear what that's going to look like. So this idea of like having optionality, and I mean, one of the things you could maybe infer from the initial implementation of tariffs is that, again, maybe Western Hemisphere and specifically Mexico, Canada will be, I want to say a little bit less encumbered by tariffs going forward. I certainly don't think that they are going to avoid that. And I do think that there's a lot of political gamesmanship that still is going to happen back and forth. But like in that world here, it actually makes sense to identify, like, let's say I was in Southeast Asia, let's identify some relationships that are nearshored, Mexico, maybe Western Hemisphere, however you want to think about that. And then let's identify also some manufacturers that are onshore. And at the end of the day, if you're able to do that, and I appreciate and respect that it's a significant investment to like build those relationships and actually vet those suppliers out. But at the end of the day, like if you were able to have a system where you could be agile, right? So you could quickly say, okay, I have a couple of vetted suppliers in these different geographies. And so if we are in a world where tariffs change and, and the volatility that we're seeing now continues to happen, like that's really what you would want, like to respond to that, right? You would want to be able to quickly be like, okay, I want to get quotes so I can see a right price, right timeline for multiple suppliers. You kind of agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's this whole idea of dual sourcing, which does get pretty complicated. So to get in the weeds a bit there, when you're dual sourcing components, there is a cost a lot of times because you'll have to have FAIs from two suppliers on a certain part and have two approved. But I think, you can have this dual sourcing mentality of ensuring, hey, I have 4 or 5 suppliers across, 3 or 4 different nations where I can get the same type of products. So not that you need to dual source down to every component level, but ensuring, hey, if the Mexico tariffs do ramp back up this summer, I have suppliers in, whether it be Argentina or the United States who can go and do those same types of parts and maybe, kind of fold that demand in elsewhere. I think that's a key because, having redundancy at the part level is difficult, but having redundancy across capabilities is necessary.
Yeah, no, that's super thoughtful. And it actually makes me think it's very interesting. Like you have this whole generation of supply chain strategists and supply chain professionals, especially the ones that grew up in like the 2000s and 2010s, that were almost trained to like cut down as few suppliers as possible, drive as efficient as possible, like put all of our eggs in one basket. And that world is gone.
Yeah, when I started in aerospace in the 2010s, it was very clear. I was for a division of a very large aerospace prime, and we had over 3,000 suppliers for our division, and we had KPIs for our supply chain group that were very clear of cutting 10% of your suppliers out every year and cutting 10% of costs by moving everything to either India or China. And that was it. Everything domestic had to be pushed overseas. And we had some strong partnerships where we were even taking a Wisconsin-based manufacturer and they went and bought a facility in Bangalore and they would train up people to move their own work. So, you had American companies training people in Bangalore to go and take these parts overseas. And, it was strong in that sense because you knew you were getting people with expertise training what was happening. But now that large investment, if we still hold a 20 to 40% tariff against India, very quickly right now, that same company is most likely thinking, well, my Wisconsin facility needs to double in size and I need to get rid of this Bangalore one.
That actually speaks to the kind of the craziness of the world of the last 20 years, in which like the economic incentives would be such that that would actually make sense for a business to do. You've never told me that story before.
Yeah.
That's crazy. And it actually speaks to the idea of like actually putting structures in place to drive some of this work or keep some of this work in the country will provide some enduring and positive impacts, regardless of how traumatic this is or feels right now.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the tariff issue right now, I mean, people are talking about Boeing, and people are saying we don't even understand how many parts of a 737 are actually made overseas when you look at the entire supply chain. So, I think it's the necessity of understanding, okay, how much can we work with our near shore partners, our allies, and everything like that. And, it's kind of funny because everybody for the last 10, 15 years has been talking about Taiwan, and it gets, a bigger an issue every day. And if anything, this is a bit of a dry run, right? Because Southeast Asia is being hit with the heaviest tariffs. And, you'd have to imagine if there was a Taiwan issue that occurred, China wouldn't be your only problem. There's not going to be ships leaving Vietnam up behind the first island chain if there's an issue in Taiwan. So it kind of gives people the ability to look at their supply chain and say, how do I not just look at China's, but the Philippines, Vietnam, all Southeast Asia is a risk environment.
Yeah, no, look, again, and without going too deeply back into this idea of tariffs, not tariffs, value judgments, et cetera, I mean, the world is such that industrial strength is national strength, full stop. Like we have been very acutely reminded that that there are countries who have guns and they have tanks and they use them to push national interests. And this idea that that conflict is sustained via industrial strength, and the idea that we don't have the ability to manufacture and sustain like war stocks for critical items is just a significant strategic problem.
Yeah. And that's where I think the debate, like a lot of people agree with this idea of reindustrialization, and then the debate of tariffs is the right way to do it. But to your point earlier, it doesn't really matter. We know that reindustrialization is necessary for all of our Western allies. We saw what's happening in Germany and France with the large investment in defense, and that's going to help their overall industry there. And, one thing people like to say is, what's being made in China, do American workers really want to be making these small, gadgets, and like these factory jobs are not great. But a lot of people are making good points today that having these capabilities to make a lot of these small commoditized items are actually those same capabilities that end up leading to your industrial capabilities at wartime. I mean, when you look at what happened in World War II, refrigerator makers ended up making all the 50 cal machine guns. So you turn these more commoditized capabilities into your, actually war machine when necessary. So you do have to have, those capabilities in your own nation. You can't just be a services country.
Yeah. No, and we spent a lot of time talking about this, and the fundamental thesis of Sustainment actually as a dual-use technology business. We sell software into the Department of Defense and into commercial manufacturers here. I mean, really is this idea that if something, God forbid, should happen, like we will need a Freedom's Forge type movement here, where we actually look at all of the excellent commercial manufacturing capacity in the United States, and we really figure out a way to reach into that to expand defense manufacturing. Like there's no other way that will go. And so this is important strategically. And but again, like businesses live and die in the tactics, right? So to come back kind of into the tactics on this thing and kind of to get back from to reorient around the company, business owner, business leader perspective here, let's talk about like U.S. suppliers, right? So I'm trying to build a U.S. supply chain. And I'm trying to do that in a world where everybody else is also trying to build a U.S. supply chain. So my existing U.S. suppliers are probably getting, blown up with inbound right now from other folks to see what they're up to. Then I'm trying to figure out how to be heard and get above the noise here so that I can develop new relationships with new suppliers, given that they're also getting inundated with a lot of inbound. Let's talk specifically about U.S. manufacturers.
Yeah, and I think U.S. manufacturers, let's say you see this as your opportunity to gain work, right? I have seen and had discussions with a few, large injection molding houses, large machine shops in the last couple of weeks, and I think the way they're taking it is they're, proactively approaching their customers and making it clear of, hey, I'm getting busy. I've been working with you for a long time, but here's my capacity. Let's look at the other stuff you want to bring back reshore or nearshore, and I will help you get quotes very quickly so you can start doing this analysis. So having that proactive relationship of reaching out to your customers and saying, hey, are there, part families you need me to look at? Are there, different commodities you want me to see if I can help you with? As a supply chain person, that's really helpful because you're kind of leaning out and saying, hey, we have capacity to take you on, take on more work. So if you're trying to take advantage of this situation, I'd say proactively reaching out to buyers and supply chain personnel that you've worked with is great because they could probably use the help. And then I would say if you're looking to ensure that, suppliers are going to have capacity for you and, that you're trying to add new capabilities domestically, I would be expanding my horizons quite a bit right now. This is a time where you probably want to not just be talking to suppliers you've been working with for many years, but probably reaching out to 10 to 12 suppliers on each different family of parts you're wanting to do and start going, if you're a Florida-based manufacturer, reach out to companies in Colorado and California because it's not just a time where you can work with people regionally. You need to see who has capacity around the country because this is going to be a countrywide effort.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and so in that, if I peel that back, so there's number one, the first point I think is really anchoring your relationships with your current suppliers, right? So you've got this idea of, okay, I need to not assume that I'm on autopilot with my supplier because again, they're having lots of options. They have they're getting inundated with other requests. So this idea of actually leaning into your existing relationships, I think is kind of step one, right? So let's go reinvest in that relationship. Let's go, do another visit and actually thinking about what international sources of supply or like what parts you're doing offshore that you could potentially also layer on top of some of your existing manufacturing suppliers to be like more important to them. So there's that first piece of like, let's not, again, I think the idea is don't be sole source anywhere. Like if you're single source anywhere, there is risk. And so, looking at your existing manufacturers, making sure that you are top of mind so that you don't have other people that come in and kind of take their capacity off of you and that you've got a good sense of like, okay, there are people that I trust that I already work with. What else could they potentially do for me? I think that's step one. And then step two is this idea of like figuring out how to reach out and who else is out there. And, again, this is another thing that we spend a lot of time talking about. It's one of the fundamental theses of this business is that one of the challenges of manufacturing supply chains in the United States is that it is a very fragmented industry in the sense that I mean that there are these kind of regional silos of manufacturers who all know each other. There are these industry silos of manufacturers who all know each other, but there is remarkably little overlap between, larger OEMs in Florida area reaching, who do maybe a defense product or a medical device product, reaching into the oil and gas manufacturers in the Texas-Oklahoma corridor who could build parts for that. There's just a lot of disconnection between those. And so, you get to the point where you're like in, internet hell trying to reach out and say, who's got great websites on Google that I can figure out, or I'm asking around, or I'm leveraging my associations. But talk a little bit about this supplier identification, developing relationships with new suppliers, like, talk about that process. And then as a follow-up, I'm going to ask you how you can prepare and like how organized you need to be when you go have those combos as well.
Yeah, one of the points you made was really good where, talking about going from aerospace to oil and gas, there's a large machine shop in the Southeast, I know, that they had started in oil and gas, and they were able to go and market their very technical expertise into aerospace and defense. And now they're a heavily aerospace and defense business. They're well diversified, and they're one of the strongest shops in the country. And I always thought that was very impressive, but it also made me realize, to your point, that supply chain personnel are always, if you're an aerospace buyer, you're looking for people who've been making similar parts for the same type of components and assemblies as the past. But in reality, if you go across industries, whether it's medical for the smaller and higher precision parts or oil and gas for larger precision parts, going across industry and trying to find people where those capabilities may not have gone into aerospace yet, but they actually are very technically ready. I think that's something to be ready for. So actually, as you're searching for suppliers, if you're aerospace, making sure you're looking at oil and gas and medical suppliers, and maybe you're working with them to get to that AS9100 type certification and seeing, what's that gap so you can begin working with them in the coming months. And as you're doing this, this is that time where kind of going to that tiger team or war room situation is key, because you're going to have a problem where your buyers and your sourcing personnel, they're fighting fires today, and it's very reactive. But taking one or two people from your team and making them proactive and saying, okay, for the next 3 months, your job is to go source new suppliers for us to quote, and actually letting them dedicate capacity to it. Because I think that's one of the hardest things in supply chain is you're constantly, chasing suppliers for late parts, quality issues. You're running those kinds of meetings in the business, and you're not proactively able to go find those new suppliers. I think these teams today need to look at, if I have 10 people, how can I take 2 of these people, put them on a 3-month-long project where they don't have to be in the weeds every day and they can actually go source those suppliers? That'll make a huge difference in your business when you look at the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, no, look, I think that there is a couple of really important points that you just made there. And so, like, one of the things, like one of my high conviction beliefs is that there is a lot more capacity in the United States manufacturing system than is being used right now. And I think it's these silos, this issue of silos and looking cross industry that is really the root of this. Because if you look at it, like as these industries have evolved, I mean, the same CNC machines that are, building oil and gas equipment can be used to build aviation parts, can be used to build medical devices. And some of these large, like kind of horizontal contract manufacturers have done a great job of expanding their businesses and supporting multiple industries and so on. But there are like literally tens of thousands of businesses that have not. They have the customers that they know, they sell into the markets that they know, they have the relationships that they know. But in reality, there are so many opportunities to actually say, no, okay, I actually need somebody who has these machines, who can work at these tolerances with these materials. And okay, so you have a different version of ISO, than the one to support my industry. That's something that we could probably work together on if I'm interested in that. But I actually believe you could do the work. So let's build a relationship and see if there's a way to pull you into that. Like that's a big unlock from my perspective.
Definitely. And I had a good amount of experience in a previous role where a lot of what we did was actually up-level shops that would have little to no quality standards. And actually you get a big cost savings out of doing this as well. Because if you're the one to bring a supplier up capabilities and then you land working them while their shop rates are still low because they have not had customers come and take advantage of those certifications, it's actually a large way to get cost savings. Because what will happen is as these suppliers gain more capabilities and these registrations, more customers will find them and their shop rates go up over time, right? Simple supply and demand. But if you're able to actually bring these suppliers up capability-wise yourself, you are kind of able to get a captive supplier at a lower shop rate before other people discover them. It usually takes 1 to 2 years before, they have a good enough business development cycle themselves to go land more customers because they also want to make more money. But, it's not just a way to get more capacity. It's also a good cost savings initiative.
Yeah. Look, and this is what winning looks like. Both as a company, as a buyer in a procurement team, and as a country, candidly. Like if we can actually have the incentives or compulsion or however we want to talk about these tariffs, but that actually force people to go have these conversations, which results in these suppliers upskilling, making the investments, doing these things, which allows them to get more business, generate revenues, which allows them to hire more skilled technicians at competitive wages and invest in advanced technology and so on. Like that's what winning looks like. And I actually think that this idea of like having these grassroots movements, where buyers and suppliers are making organic connections, are investing accordingly and so on, like that's actually how we reindustrialize as a country. It happens like one supplier connection at a time.
You're right. It can be very much a pull or push to reindustrialize, right? And like supply chain can be that pull to bring people up level. And I think that'll be interesting to see over the coming years.
Yeah, no, look, I appreciate that. And so to summarize, I guess as we go through this conversation, so we had the first point was really taking a look at your supply chain and deciding what are the things that I want to look to potentially transition now versus transitioning later. I think that's where we started as as the way. And you made a recommendation around a tiger team or some sort of like a special initiative in your company that has executive sponsorship, like that the businesses that we see that are successful in this is not a junior buyer, trying to go be a hero. It's actually a C-suite level initiative that says, I want to revisit our cost structure and I want to relook at our supply chain. So I think what we've landed on is kind of step one is identifying what you want to tackle, because you cannot eat the whole elephant at once. Step two then is this idea of identifying both nearshore and onshore alternative sources of supply so that you've got multiple options, right? And again, I think that there are going to be some cases where you're going to be willing to eat a tariff for a non-shore manufacturer based on the cost differential for, nearshore versus onshore. And there are going to be other situations where you're not going to want to do that, right? Where you're going to actually have to go onshore. So the second piece is then developing these alternatives. I think the third thing that we landed on is when you're looking at your U.S. manufacturers specifically, like leaning into the relationship, starting with your current suppliers to make sure you understand their actual capabilities, capacity, et cetera, and like being top of mind to make sure that that you don't potentially get left behind in that. So leaning into those relationships and also being willing to look outside of your exact industry experience and think at the like equipment and capability and skill set level of could that manufacturer build, maybe they haven't built a part for a pump or for whatever, but could they do that? And then as a fourth point here that we've kind of talked through all of this is at the end of the day, you need to be agile. Like you need to be able to move quickly on all this thing, on all of these different ideas. And when I say quickly, it's both like identifying alternative sources of supply, but to the end of the day, like this is actually about RFQ velocity and the ability to say, I need this thing built. Like who can do it on the time at the cost that I need, layering in total cost of ownership and some of these different calculations. But this idea of being able to like quickly get multiple quotes so that you actually have the options, have the ability to get pricing, have the ability to be dynamic if all of a sudden, the tariff gets quadrupled on country X, which I think we're going to see a lot of in our near future here. But so I think those four steps are pretty thoughtful and pretty straightforward here. Is there anything you'd add to that?
I think there's one last one, and this, really harkening back to my supply chain background. If you're in procurement or you're in sourcing today, one of the ways that, you prove you're not just a cog in the machine is creativity. Like that's why we have this profession. So, simple ways to have conversations with suppliers saying, hey, how can I make sure that I'm a priority to you? Maybe this is one of those times where you cut your payment terms in half. Maybe this is a time where you go ahead and invest in raw materials for the suppliers and you help them with cash flows. Find ways to creatively help your suppliers and really make sure that you're top of mind. You're already taking massive headwinds right now. If you can find ways to, bring these long-term relationships to a place where those suppliers can grow with you, I think, having those more in the weeds conversations about their business will help you very deeply.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It actually makes me think through this whole theme that we would be remiss to not cover here in this conversation is the idea that says, look, like, okay, so in the old world, we were looking at trying to collapse supply chains, trying to offshore, trying to have as few sources of supply. In this new world, we need to be agile. We need to be dynamic. We need to be always looking at different options. We need to have this network, like a significant relationship network here. And I think underpinning that is the statement that I think is obvious to us just because of where we sit, but may or may not be obvious to the folks who listen to this. But this idea that like, being a buyer or being in a procurement team is a deeply, deeply complicated and strategic job. Like the days of thinking of those teams as kind of an administrative function and they just have to go through, the manual process of doing quotes or whatever, like that world is over. And the businesses who think about that and kind of downplay the significance of those people as creative professionals who are actual significant value drivers of the business, like that world is over. And I think that that's a really, really important realization that this needs to be like a C-suite initiative. And it doesn't matter if it runs through a VP procurement or a COO or actually a CEO level initiative. But like this idea of like, I mean, your ability to sell your product to your customers is predicated on the effectiveness of your supply chain. And in a world where things are a little high adventure and will continue to be high adventure, like that team is one of the most important assets in your business.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting working in supply chain in the 2010s, and then the 2020s come around and working in supply chain becomes one of the sexiest jobs in business. So to all the sourcing and procurement professionals, you're finally getting your comeuppance.
Oh, preach. Yeah, we started this business in 2020 and running around talking to investors about manufacturing and supply chain technology is like, oh my gosh. But yeah, no, as we go and as COVID happens and as Ukraine happens and so on, like this is very much top of mind.
Yeah.
And look, so it's a pleasure to be with you here today. I hope this conversation was valuable to you all who are listening. Please do come check us out at sustainment.com. We'd love to share more thoughts and more insights there, and I'm grateful to you.
Yeah, great conversation. Thanks, Bret.